The word gospel means good news. And we have a tendency to use gospel and good news interchangeably. But after a parable like the one I just read, it might be hard to figure out where the good news is. Think about the characters in the story. There is the landowner who goes away on a trip, his tenants who he entrusts his vineyard and its proceeds to. There are the servants of the landowner who he sends to collect his profits, and then who are killed or beaten by the tenants. And then finally there's the son of the landowner who is also killed. And in addition to the characters in the story, we have three other characters or sets of characters in this entire gospel. We have Jesus, who's telling the parable. We have the disciples to whom Jesus is speaking and teaching. And then the religious authorities who are hearing Jesus' teaching as well. So when I read this gospel, were you able to locate yourself in the story? How did you feel when it was being read? Whenever I hear this story, my first response is almost always fear. Fear that I'm going to be like the tenants and thrown out of God's kingdom because of my greed and not holding up my end of the bargain with God. And then my second reaction is usually anger. Why is Jesus telling such a horrible story? And what about if you were one of the disciples hearing this story? How would you feel? Or one of the religious authorities? I imagine the disciples were probably fearful of the same things that we are. And the religious authorities were probably angry, maybe like we are. Especially when we consider the timing of this parable. This parable occurs just after Jesus has turned the temple upside down and railed against the way they've turned his Father's house into a money-making enterprise. So after all this mayhem, we have a series of parables that are some pretty harsh judgments on the religious authorities. There are lots of ways we can look at today's parable, and a popular interpretation is an allegorical one. And while I generally stay away from allegory, in most cases I think it really works with this parable, and particularly in Matthew's version of this parable. An allegorical interpretation takes the meaning inside the story and attaches it to events happening outside the story. An allegorical interpretation would have the landowner representing God, the vineyard as the people of Israel, the tenants as the religious authorities, the servants as the whole history of the prophets in Israel. And of course, Jesus would be the son of the landowner as the Son of God. So when we look at this parable from this interpretation, we can see that Jesus is telling all those gathered around him and us what fate awaits him and how he sees himself as part of this long tradition of prophets, prophetic voices in Israel who, like Isaiah, what we heard in today's reading, whose messages are always about turning their hearts back to God. I mean, that is the primary message of the prophets, kind of keeping the people of Israel in line. At the same time, Jesus is calling the religious authorities into account for their treatment of him. But not only of him, but what has been entrusted to them, the people of Israel, God's chosen people, with whom God made a covenant of love. And while God hopes that the love of God shown to them will be received and grown in them, they continually fail on their end of the covenant. With all the tension that's going on in this gospel, I mean, we're getting very close to the time that Jesus is going to the cross. This parable in particular, I think, is a pivotal point, a point when Jesus calls the question. The debate has gone on too long. He is headed toward the cross, and he's telling them, teaching them through the parable, that he is serious about what is happening in Israel, what is happening to the people of God. The question he is calling is about fear and power. It's about love and justice, mercy and the grace of God. Are they going to participate in God's mercy and justice? Are they going to take the risk to see the world through the loving eyes of God? Or are they going to continue along the same path they've been on, ignoring the words of the prophets, looking out for themselves, not returning to God, being like those wild grapes that we heard of in the Isaiah reading, not producing the fruit that is recognizable as part of God's kingdom? I don't think this is the only time in the Gospels when Jesus calls the question, nor do I think it is the only time in history. There are many moments in the life of the church when we have had to take stock of where we are and return to God, make a real clear turning. The Great Reformation was one of those times, when the excesses of the church were really out of hand. I would say we are also in one of those times right now, not just as the Episcopal Church, but the whole Christian church. We have so many different theologies that are really at war with one another. And we have issues in the church like what's going on with Roman Catholic priests and the sex scandal in the church that way. We have issues in the Episcopal Church about who's in and who's out. Is it okay to ordain gay and lesbian people? Is it not okay? Is it okay for them to love each other? Is it not okay? So in the midst of all this time of reform, we are also being called to return to God, to return to that source of love. And of course, the question also gets called on us as individual Christians. Any time in our lives when we realize the path we are headed down is a dead-end path, that is a time of choice and opportunity, a time when God is calling the question on us to return to God and find love and life again. And we've all been there. We've all had times when we come up against a wall in our life and we know we need to change, but that we are powerless to change without God. So here is the heart of the gospel, the good news. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Jesus takes the tragic end of this parable and from it proclaims the goodness of God. It isn't easy to recognize. We tend to hear what we fear, rejection and death, being excluded. But Jesus is telling us that yes, his death is certain, but from his death will come the resurrection. From his death will come the means of grace for us. And we've all been taught that resurrection is something we must believe in order to be Christians. But how often do we really consider what the resurrection means in our daily lives? I think so often it remains sort of cerebral enterprise to consider resurrection and sort of futuristic. We're looking at the promise of heaven at the end of our lives. But Jesus has a different message. The kingdom of God is here and now. The resurrection is alive in our lives now. The good news of Jesus is waiting for us now. That which we fear, that which we reject in our own lives, in our communities, in ourselves, God will use as a means of grace for us if we turn our hearts to God and allow God to change us, to transform us. Here is the power of the gospel, the good news of Jesus in our lives, but not only for us. When our lives become like the vineyard God designed, one that bears good fruit, there is something very contagious about it. There is something about the love and mercy and justice of God, who is ready to receive us no matter where we are on our journey of faith, that is irresistible. And why wouldn't it be? It truly is good news that no matter how bad you think you are, no matter how bad you think things in your life are, no matter what you fear or want to reject or want to get rid of in yourself, through Christ, God's love will transcend those fears.